Shohei Ohtani didn't dominate, and somehow that's exactly why this outing matters more than most of his great ones. 6 innings, 1 run, only 2 strikeouts. On paper, it looks efficient, maybe even routine. But underneath, this was one of the clearest signs yet that Ohtani's margin for error, no matter how elite, is not infinite. Because for the first time this season, he didn't look in control. He looked human. The Dodgers entered this game in a position to sweep. Everything was aligned: momentum, pitching, rhythm. Ohtani takes the mound for his second start of the season, coming off a dominant first outing. The expectation wasn't just effectiveness, it was continuation. Instead, the first few innings told a different story. Command was inconsistent, the splitter had no bite, the curveball lacked shape, and most telling, hitters weren't missing. Only 2 strikeouts across 6 innings. That's not just low for Ohtani. That's structurally different from how he typically succeeds. Yet despite all of that, he allowed just 1 run. That contrast is where the real story begins. The obvious narrative is easy to settle into. Ohtani didn't have his best stuff, but he grinded through it. Veteran outing, controlled damage, gave his team a chance to win. That's the traditional framing, and it's valid. But it doesn't explain how a pitcher with compromised command and reduced swing and miss still avoids the big inning. Because normally when Ohtani loses sharpness, the damage isn't gradual, it's sudden. We've seen that before. 1 inning spirals, 1 sequence collapses. That didn't happen here. So the question becomes, what changed? The answer isn't velocity. In fact, his fastball was stronger, averaging 98.3 and touching over 100. That should have elevated his dominance. Instead, it masked something deeper. This outing wasn't about overpowering hitters, it was about surviving sequences. Early in the game, Ohtani's issue wasn't just command, it was timing within his delivery. The release point drifted, the arm lagged behind the lower half. That's why the splitter flattened and the curveball didn't finish. Mechanically, he wasn't synced, and when that happens, pitchers usually compensate by overthrowing. That leads to worse results. But Ohtani didn't fully fall into that trap. Instead, he made a subtle adjustment, not in mechanics, but in approach. He stopped trying to finish hitters early. That's the key shift. Rather than forcing strikeouts, he leaned into contact management, more fastballs in controlled zones, less reliance on secondary pitches that weren't responding. That's a difficult pivot to make in real time, especially for a pitcher wired to dominate. And it's why this outing holds more analytical value than a typical dominant start. Here's the hidden factor. Fatigue didn't just affect his stuff, it altered his decision-making speed. Before the game, Ohtani admitted he didn't feel right, physically and mechanically. Add in the context: cross-country travel, early game times, disrupted sleep patterns, and you get a player operating below optimal rhythm. For most pitchers, that leads to collapse. For Ohtani, it led to delay. He was slightly slower to commit to pitches, slightly less aggressive in sequences, and while that reduced his strikeouts, it also prevented overexposure. He didn't push himself into a catastrophic inning. He hovered just below that threshold. That's a razor-thin balance, and it's why he made it through 6 innings. The turning point in this outing wasn't a strikeout or a big pitch. It was the moment he accepted he didn't have his best stuff. That realization changes everything. Because once a pitcher stops chasing dominance, they start managing risk. And from that point on, Ohtani stopped trying to be overpowering and started being precise in a different way. Not sharper, but smarter. That's why the Blue Jays couldn't break through. They made contact, they had opportunities, but they never caught him in a moment of escalation. There was no inning where his intensity spiked beyond control. Everything stayed contained. And that's incredibly difficult to do when you're not at your best. But here's where the game flips. Ohtani exits after 6 innings with a 2-1 lead. Job done. Under normal circumstances, that outing is enough to secure a win. But baseball doesn't evaluate performance in isolation. The Dodgers' bullpen falters, the lead disappears. The game ends in a 4-3 loss. And suddenly, Ohtani's effort feels diminished in the final result. But analytically, it shouldn't be. Because this game wasn't lost on the mound during those 6 innings. It was decided later, when the margin Ohtani preserved was no longer protected, and that distinction matters. For the Dodgers, the bigger takeaway isn't the loss. It's what this outing reveals about Ohtani's sustainability. This is his first full return to two-way play since 2023. And already in just his second start, we're seeing the early signs of strain. Nothing alarming, but noticeable. The lack of sync, the reduced feel, the need to adjust mid-game. These are small indicators, but they point to a larger truth. Even for Ohtani, the two-way workload isn't seamless. It requires constant recalibration, and over a long season, those micro-adjustments accumulate. For Ohtani himself, this outing might be more valuable than a dominant one because it tests a different skill. Not how great he can be, but how stable he can remain when he's not. That's what defines elite durability, not peak performance, but controlled imperfection. There's also a visual that captures this entire game. Ohtani walking to the mound early, his uniform covered in dirt from a pickoff attempt. It's unusual, almost jarring, because we're used to seeing him clean, composed, precise. But here, he looked disrupted before he even threw a pitch. And that image holds, because throughout the game, he never fully looked settled, yet he still delivered. That's the paradox, and it leads to the bigger question. At what point does finding a way stop being enough? Because over time, fatigue doesn't just affect one outing. It compounds. It turns small inefficiencies into larger vulnerabilities. And eventually, even elite adjustment isn't enough to contain it. That moment hasn't arrived. Not even close. But this outing is a preview of what it might look like when it does begin. Not a collapse, not a disaster, just a version of Ohtani that's slightly off and forced to work harder to stay effective. In the end, the most important takeaway isn't that he allowed one run, it's that he had to think his way through it. Because when a player like Ohtani stops relying purely on ability and starts relying on management, that's when you see the full picture, not just greatness, but its limits. And on this night, for 6 innings, he operated right on that edge. He looked off before the game even started. And for once, Shohei Ohtani didn't hide it. Tired, out of sync, not right. That's not something you hear often from the most unstoppable player in baseball. And when he took the mound against the Toronto Blue Jays, it showed immediately. The command wasn't there. The rhythm, gone. Splitters floated, curveballs missed, fastballs had to bail him out. He struck out just 2 hitters. 2. That's his lowest total ever in a start longer than 4 innings. For most pitchers, that's just an off night. For Ohtani, that's a crack. But here's where it gets strange, because even when everything looked wrong, the result didn't. 6 innings, 1 run allowed, 4 hits. That's a quality start. That's winning baseball. And somehow, he did it without looking like himself. That's the tension. Because while Ohtani battled through 6, the Los Angeles Dodgers had control. Up 2-1, game in hand. Until it wasn't. The bullpen slipped, the lead vanished. Final score 4-3 Blue Jays. And just like that, Ohtani's grind turned into a loss. That's the emotional spike. He did enough, more than enough, and it still didn't matter. But the real story isn't the loss, it's what we saw underneath it. Because this wasn't dominance, this was survival. Early in the game, Ohtani looked like he was fighting himself. Mechanics drifting, timing off, every pitch a correction. Manager Dave Roberts saw it too. Out of sync, grinding through every inning, and yet he never broke. That's the turning point. Even at less than full strength, he still controlled the damage, and that's where things get bigger than one game, because the reason behind it matters. Fatigue, cross-country travel, early game times, short recovery windows, and for a player doing 2 jobs, pitcher and hitter, that strain multiplies fast. We've seen this before. Go back to the 2025 World Series short rest. Heavy workload, and cracks started to show. Even then, he pushed through. But nights like this, they're reminders. Ohtani isn't built like everyone else, but he's not untouchable either. He reached base twice in this game, still impacting both sides, still producing. But when he walked off the field, arm wrapped in ice, body dragging just a little, he didn't look like a myth. He looked human. And that changes the conversation, because the question isn't if Ohtani can dominate. We already know he can. The question is how long he can carry both roles before something gives. For the Dodgers, that's everything. Protect him too much, and you limit greatness. Push him too far, and you risk losing it. And right now, they're walking that line. One game didn't break him, but it showed something rare. A version of Shohei Ohtani that doesn't show up often. Not unstoppable, not perfect, just fighting. And somehow, still delivering.